Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Piczówka niewiód.
Hello everyone. I hope everyone is staying safe and properly sequestering themselves in their own homes. The big thing I'm focusing on, and I hope other people are as well, is keeping myself healthy and productive. We can make this into a vacation and mess around and eat bread and desserts and get all fat and sassy, or we can use this time to cook delicious healthy meals and do some home workouts. We can get things done on to-do lists that have been sitting around for months, or we can watch Netflix. I'm having moments of pure unproductivity, but I snap out of it and I'm actually taking care of things that have fallen to the wayside and feel pretty good about it. Hopefully everyone listening is staying motivated and optimistic and making the best of this situation. You certainly have the power to do so. It's up to you. I did this podcast with my new friend Dr. Aseem Malhotra a couple weeks ago, and I think he has some great info to share. He's doing some awesome things out there across the pond. I just posted a video he sent me of him on a news program talking about how important it is to stay metabolically healthy in these crazy times. Underlying metabolic disease, such as obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes, are huge risk factors with coronavirus. Luckily, everyone listening is probably very metabolically healthy or on a journey towards that. Dr. Steve Malhotra is becoming one of the most influential cardiologists in Britain and a world-leading expert in the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of heart disease. He is successfully leading the campaign against excessive sugar consumption. The award-winning NHS cardiologist has successfully motivated leading academics, the media, and politicians to make sugar reduction a healthy priority in the UK by publishing commentaries in the BMJ and mainstream media. He also created the film The Big Fat Fix with Donal O'Neill. A few quick notes. We'll be putting a limited number of Nose to Tail boxes on nosetotale.org Thursday. We weren't ready for this rush of orders, but got everything shipped out to those who ordered in the past 2 days. We're ramping things up and should have more and more meat as the weeks roll on. The Sapien program is coming soon, so be ready. Make sure you're subscribed to the newsletter on sapien.org. Other than that, just make sure to rate this show on iTunes or the podcast app. Start back at episode 1, share with a friend, and support the show on Patreon. I continually turn down sponsors to the show and I'm leaving a lot of money on the table. I really don't want to have any affiliation with advertisers, even if they have good products. I think everyone can agree this would be better. This only works if people support the show. And on that note, let's get to it. Here's Dr. Aseem Malhotra. We got an hour here. We're recording. We finally got this.
All right.
All right, my
By
man.
the way, I don't know about body tricks or body matrix or something. I had this body composition scan done in London just by chance on the weekend. I was at its exhibition and it gave me my metabolic age is 29, which means I'm like 13 years younger than my actual age, which is pretty cool.
I love it. Yeah.
I put that in my new book, right? Follow my advice and you'll add 10 years to your life.
That's the plan. I mean, yeah, me and you, we get a lot of people thinking we're younger than we are. I think it's a good thing.
Exactly.
Well, now you proved it. So, yeah, what did that say? So, yeah, what did it tell you about your body?
Oh, it was just it was different things: basal metabolic rate, muscle mass, skeletal mass, visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, all of those things, basically. I'm not sure how it does a metabolic age calculation, but it says that you have the body of an average 29-year-old.
I like it. I've been talking to a doctor who wants to give me an MRI scan and do that whole type of thing.
Oh, that'd be cool.
But, yeah. This is why I would like to meet people before I do a podcast with them. I feel like we're going to have a much different podcast now that we hung out. We got to know each other a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we were at the Metabolic Health Summit. We actually went to dinner with Sean Baker, Eric Westman, CrossFit Health, Karen. What a time.
Yeah, it was great. It was really great. I think the only the negative part of all of that is that we didn't have as much time together as we would have liked, right? I mean, it was a lot, packing in a lot of stuff, a lot of people
there. A lot
there.
going on. Well, I'm actually going to go back to dinner with them tomorrow night. So,
are you? With who?
With Karen and Sean Baker and Eric Westman. There's a conference tomorrow. The DAPT conference. It's in Long Beach. So I'm speaking. Dr. Gary, people know my business partner, and Sean Baker are speaking at this little Eric Westman ADAPT conference.
Oh, nice. Very cool.
Yeah, gang back together.
Enjoy.
So,
Are we started yet? Or?
yeah, we're going. This is the casual start. This is the soft intro to the podcast.
Right. Okay, fine. Great.
So, it was awesome. We did a panel discussion with you and Ben Bickman and Jamie Seaman. And then I heard you brought down the house in your presentation that I missed.
I don't know about brought down the house. Obviously, I heard
there was a standing ovation. So
I think a few people
up the house.
I think a few people stood up, but it was nice. It was a very good reception. Obviously we had a huge audience in terms of numbers. I think it was close to 1,000 people there. I had 30 minutes essentially to try and, my topic of discussion was about how one can rapidly reduce risk factors for cardiovascular disease using lifestyle. But some of that talk was also trying to make the case for why we need a paradigm shift and why the old paradigm, which is basically focused on the best way to tackle heart disease is to lower cholesterol as much as possible. Just to challenge why, that has essentially completely actually and totally and utterly failed on a population level. And that's why we need a change. And what does the science tell us about what actually is at the root of cardiovascular disease and what can we do about it? So, yeah, I think that was obviously the science part. The other part, I think that, feedback I got that people find interesting is about how, in my position that I've got to when I have a platform where I can quite often, the stuff I'm writing or talking about into the mainstream media, which of course then hits millions of people automatically, how that is a challenging process. One of the lines I use to try and emphasize that point of the challenges, the science alone isn't enough. Opposition from vested interests needs to be overcome. Because it's not like we don't know. We have enough information, enough medical science, even enough nutritional science to rapidly reduce this problem of obesity and cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and all these chronic diseases. We can have a huge impact on reducing their prevalence with the information we have already. But the challenge is actually making sure that information is disseminated to everybody so that everyone's aware and fully informed about the choices they make, but also about the policy changes that are needed to help encourage more healthy behaviors, which are going to have a much more powerful impact than sort of individual behavior on an individual level.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We have the science. It's basically pretty solid at this point. It's just people don't know about it or people are resisting it. This old paradigm persists. And it's super hard to get people to change that when they've been in that world their whole life. And so you're working to do that. So tell people a little bit more about yourself. You're, one of the most influential cardiologists in Britain, right? You're doing things, you're making noise.
Yeah, I'd hope that my work has also expanded beyond Britain. But yeah, no, I mean, for me, I qualified as a medical doctor in 2001 in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And therefore I've been qualified now almost 20 years. I started obviously as a conventional medical doctor who then pursued a career, a specialization within cardiology. That was my passion and my interest. And within cardiology, I trained in interventional cardiology, which essentially is, keyhole heart surgery for people with heart disease. A very, effective, useful, powerful intervention for treating heart attacks. Not so much, in fact, almost not at all for people with stable disease, as we now know. But that was my passion and my interest. And then I realized probably over around 7-8 years of my career, initially as a junior doctor, and then as I progressed within my career, working on the front line within the National Health Service and being very aware of the increasing pressure on the system because of more and more people coming in with multi-morbidity, essentially chronic disease. At the same time, I'm becoming familiar with, or in fact, unavoidable, really, in terms of the issue about the obesity epidemic and all of the public health statements that are coming out saying we've got this problem. In fact, 2004 is when the World Health Organization originally announced it to be a major global issue. And yet I had noticed or observed that we hadn't made any inroads at all. The prevalence was increasing. The number of kids who are overweight or obese, certainly in the UK, are about 1 in 3 by the time they reach secondary school, which is the age of 11. And I know that the trends are very similar, if not slightly worse, in the United States. So for me, my original journey was to try and do my bit to really tackle or get to the root of the problem. And one of the first things, which I still I think hasn't changed, although the understanding has evolved a little bit about how you define these sorts of foods. But the first thing was the realization that, of course, we are consuming way too much junk food. In my own hospital, we were selling or promoting the same sorts of foods that you get on the high street that are ultra processed junk. So my first initial advocacy or campaigning was around highlighting the fact that our hospitals had become a branding opportunity for junk food industry. And I wrote a piece which took several months to get published, because it's not easy. If you're a non-journalist, you probably would know this, Brian, if you're a non-journalist, it's extremely difficult to get anything published in something that's a mainstream newspaper. So that was a big hurdle for me. And with a bit of support and encouragement from a journalist friend of mine who I'd got to know over the previous few months and talked to him about this issue, suddenly I'm my article, which was called "I Mend Hearts, Then I See Our Hospitals Serve Junk Food to My Patients," was a front page commentary in the Observer newspaper. And just to give you context about how certainly the editors of the newspaper thought how important that was, they put that as a front page commentary. On the second page, the new Prime Minister, David Cameron, had a half a page article. So they put mine as, talking about his new vision of a big society. So that then, I think, really launched me a bit more into sort of mainstream cred. And then things just took off from there. I started then writing, not so long after that, I started writing for the British Medical Journal. They had asked me to, I'd written a few articles actually after that for the Observer and the Guardian. And then they got in touch, and I had quite a few ideas of various things I think needed to be highlighted, which were all related to obesity and cardiovascular disease. And that ranged from, I did my own investigation. Actually, one of the first article I wrote for them actually was an investigation about how the dietary guidelines had been influenced by the sugar industry, specifically about sugar. And what I discovered, and this is all stuff I did myself on my own, is that in Europe, certainly, the nutritional labeling on foods were suggesting that you should be having 22.5 teaspoons of sugar a day as part of your guideline daily amount, which is pretty extraordinary. And I noticed there was a discrepancy between that, clearly what was on the labeling when I dived into it, and what the American Heart Association had put out in a statement in 2009. Now, one caveat here, because a lot of people who listen to this, I know that I have called out, and other people have been calling out, the conflicts of interest within the American Heart Association, which takes a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry. But this particular report was done by scientists that were completely independent. And one of the people that had became my kind of mentor, certainly when it in relation to sugar, and I learned pretty much everything I know about sugar, I've learned from him, is Robert Lustig, Professor Robert Lustig in UCSF in California. And, he's done such amazing, groundbreaking work to really get this sugar issue onto the global agenda. He was one of the co-authors on this paper. And in that paper, the American Heart Association had concluded, that mission statement or whatever, had concluded that for the average male, you should consume no more than 9 teaspoons of added sugar a day. Female 6. This is a maximum limit, by the way. And for a 4 to 8-year-old child, Brian, in the United States, they recommended a cap of no more than 3 teaspoons of added sugar. Now, just to put this in context, one small size candy bar has about 9 teaspoons.
Wow.
So the scientific evidence had said after this point is when you start to see increased risk of metabolic disease. And I thought this was just absolutely scandalous. That we had this information in 2009. I wrote this piece in 2013 May, and in that piece there was quite a lot in there. I'd said that there needs to be it was the advice on the dietary advice on added sugar is in need of emergency surgery. That was the title of the piece, and the BMJ press released it, and BBC News prime time, breakfast TV picked it up. One of the newspapers picked it up. And that was really how the whole action on sugar in the UK movement started, which I then became science director of, because I then got contacted by some very eminent scientists and powerful scientists who said, listen, we read your article. We think it's great. Come and speak to us. We had a big meeting. And then we launched Action on Sugar, which was less than a year from then. And I had a role to play in coordinating the experts we get together, writing the press release, my contacts with the press, to make sure that when we hit the ground, then it was going to have impact, and it had even bigger impact than we expected. It was front page of the Daily Mail, sugar is a new tobacco. It was a global news story. And then once the ball started rolling, we then had political intervention with the chair of the all-party diabetes group, Keith Vaz, who I had also known for a while and had supported my work. And he basically put a statement, which you can even Google and see online, I think over 30 members of parliament to support what we were saying. So suddenly now you've got a political movement going on, to the point where the former Secretary for Health, Andrew Lansley, got up in parliament, and he actually was opposing what we were saying and said that it's ridiculous to compare sugar with tobacco, blah, blah, blah. And what he ultimately said in his speech was essentially, it was supporting the food industry. So then I hit back a few days later and called out the fact that he had been a consultant for many food industry firms, that, sugar was something that they profited from selling. And we didn't hear from him again. That was in the Observer. So, the rest is history, Brian, to be honest. I know that, stuff has been going on in the US, but I think this has had a huge knock-on effect globally, what we did in the UK. And I think the big win was that we then, in 2016, I was actually pleasantly surprised, because our current government is considered quite a, what we call a right-wing government that are against essential regulation. They talk about the so-called free market, which isn't really free, to be honest. It's just how it allows the industry to manipulate people more for profit. That's another discussion, another topic. They came out with a sugary drinks tax. And I was like, wow. And that's something I had pushed more than anyone. I'd written about it in medical journals. I wrote a piece in 2015 for the British Journal of Sports Medicine to re-emphasize this point, saying you can't outrun a bad diet, and emphasize how companies such as Coca-Cola were misinforming people by suggesting that it's okay to have as much sugar as you like, as long as you burn off the calories, which didn't fit with the science. You
cannot. Energy Balance Network,
which is complete and total nonsense.
It's a scam, yeah.
Totally unscientific. Because one of the things that I learned as a cardiologist as well is there's no such thing as a healthy weight. It doesn't exist. It's complete nonsense. Yeah, it's great to have a low body fat percentage, and it does have it is good for you. But there are so many people who have a normal BMI. I mean, I'm even seeing people who are personal trainers in their 50s who have got perfect body composition, having heart attacks. For them, it actually turns out to a lot of high carb, high sugar diet and stress. So even if you are doing that, and even if you're a healthy weight, if you're consuming too much junk food, you are putting yourself at risk, in particular with sugar. So I would always talk about this as about overall health, not weight. But obviously, if people get healthier, the side effect is the obesity prevalence will go down.
Absolutely. Did you get it out of the hospital too? Or is it just a sugar drink tax?
So the hospital thing has started. So I in 2013, so one of the other pieces I wrote in the BMJ in the same year is it's time to ban the sale of junk food in hospitals. Made the case for why that was actually encouraging overconsumption. It was legitimizing the consumption of junk food, because there was one interesting study in the United States that showed that pediatric institutions that had fast food chains on site or were selling junk food, people who visited the hospital just as visitors were 4 times more likely to purchase junk food when they left the hospital than people that hadn't gone to the hospital in the first place. So interestingly, through some psychological mechanism, it was making people think or believe that these foods are fine, they're not detrimental to health because it's being sold on the hospital ground. So I made this case in a piece for the BMJ, and it was timed with, I discussed it with one of the editors and said, listen, can you publish this on the day that I've been granted to go and speak and try and get a motion passed at the British Medical Association conference, which was taking place, interestingly, in Edinburgh that day, to call for a ban of junk food. So I had 3 minutes to make my case. There was then a vote. There was someone who opposed me, and it was overwhelming majority, more than 90% of the doctors there, from what I said, agreed. So then it became BMA policy that we agree that junk food should not be sold in hospitals. This was on the back of the fact that earlier, the previous year, I was actually invited to be part of a group of doctors who represent every doctor in the country. They're called the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and they had decided they wanted to do something and produce a 10-point plan on what we need to do to tackle obesity. And 6 of those points were about tackling the food environment. But I had been very strong within that group and saying, listen, as a profession, we also need to start in our own backyard. And they then got that on the agenda. So one of the points as well is that, nutritious, healthy food needs to be served in hospitals to patients and obviously available for staff. So that had all sort of kicked off. And, with the work I'd been doing, not just in my public advocacy as someone who's a commentates in the mainstream, but also private advocacy to get all the doctors on board. We then made that, by 2013, we suddenly got every single doctor, really, the bodies that represent certainly every single doctor had made a policy statement saying junk food needs to be banned from being sold in hospitals. But the next stage, the practical aspect, is actually getting the chief executives of hospitals to make sure that's implemented. And that's another challenge, because a lot of these franchises, these chains, they have contracts with hospitals that, go on for a few years. And in those contracts, for example, which you'd probably find quite shocking, Brian, there were contracts, certainly in one of the hospitals I worked in, which I won't name, because I'm sure it's similar probably in many other places around the world, including the US, that patients who are bedbound, who cannot even get up and go to the shop, essentially, to buy stuff, they would have to have on a trolley delivered to them by a staff member sugary drinks, potato chips, and candy.
Wow.
That was a contract written.
Wow.
Right? So this is just crazy. Can you imagine? And I remember actually, we had the 2012 Olympics in London, and I remember going on a ward round, and there was a patient who was admitted with a heart attack. He was diabetic, and he had type 2 diabetes, and he had a full kind of bottle of Lucozade, on his bedside, by his bedside. And I said, well, why are you drinking this? He goes, and he pointed to the Olympic symbols. They had the Olympic logo on there, because the main sponsors of the London Olympics, and this is again something I did for BBC Newsnight to highlight this, as well as I was the angry cardiologist. BBC Newsnight is a current affairs program. It has a lot of influence and impact. It's viewed by politicians, the prime minister, that kind of stuff. And they commissioned me to basically do a report for them, which was their headline that day, saying that why in the middle of an obesity epidemic have we got sponsors of the Olympics, major sponsors, which include, Mars, McDonald's, Cadbury's, Coca-Cola, for example. And what we realized or worked out is that the food industry over many years obviously had infiltrated all of these sporting events and organizations to promote their product. And the way that they got away with it is that many people, I think much less so now, I think we've evolved quite a lot in the last few years. And I'd like to think that my work has had a big impact on that, changing that perception. But for a long time, Brian, people believe that it doesn't matter what you eat as long as you exercise.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, is they sponsor the athletes, and there's Michael Phelps, who's exercising 10 hours a day, and he's chugging sodas and doing, pizzas and footlongs. And so everyone thinks that they can do that too.
Absolutely. And the thing is, most people, first of all, they're not exercising 6 hours a day. But the second thing is, and having, looked at the sports science and followed people up, certainly observationally, in terms of, there are many former athletes who are now obese. And
Absolutely.
It's probably because there's no way, once they retire, a lot of these sports, people reach their peak at best in their, early 30s. Once they retire, once they get into their 40s and 50s, they're not going to be exercising the same amount. They may well be, carrying on eating the same high carb diet. They suddenly bloat out and they have a heart attack. And,
it catches up with them too.
That doesn't need to happen.
Yeah. It's sad because it kind of masks it, because when you're young too, you can get away with things, and you can't out exercise a bad diet, but you kind of can if you're young and you're exercising like crazy. And didn't you work with someone on disproving this kind of like outrunning a bad diet thing? Yeah.
So this is 2015, British Journal of Sports Medicine. I wrote a piece with Tim Noakes and Steve Finney. And it's time to bust the myth. It wasn't just about you can't outrun a bad diet. It was also, it's time to bust the myth of physical inactivity and obesity. Because actually, when it comes to weight, for the overwhelming majority of people, exercise has no impact, Brian. It doesn't mean it's not good for you. Listen, I'm an obsessive exerciser. There are so many amazing health benefits of exercise, but weight loss is not one of them. And if you want to keep your weight down, it has to be through eating the right foods. So we published this piece, and again, it became big. The BMJ press release at British Journal of Sports Medicine is a BMJ journal, and that became a big, major, new international news story. BBC, the Washington Post then contacted me. I wrote a long read for them, which got a lot of, the editor was really delighted, because a week later he contacted me and said, listen, it's had over 1 million views. So, I think that kind of shook things up a little bit. And we concluded that piece saying, actually, ultimately, these public health problems will need regulation, including a tax on sugary drinks. But also we called for the complete dissociation of junk food and sport, which hasn't happened yet. But I think more and more athletes are coming out and realizing, that they don't want to be part of endorsing sugary drinks, etc.
I love that. And speaking of Dr. Eric Westman, he contributed a statement for the film about his patient that was in a wheelchair and did zero exercise and lost massive amounts of weight. You know, so many people reversing type 2 diabetes. He's working with all these people that aren't exercising. These people don't even have money. These people are on food
Oh,
stamps.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's another person I contacted, I connected with. I think he emailed me initially supporting some of the stuff I was writing about. He contacted me. And in fact, he's a former surgeon. He's a lord. He's a member of the House of Lords called Ian McCall. And he was a health minister under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And there's a rumor that people said, he was Margaret Thatcher's favorite doctor. But anyway, Ian is very much on board with us. And he also, I quoted him in my first book, The Piopi Diet, and there was a line he gave, which was great, saying that people do not have to increase their exercise level 1 iota in order to lose weight. They just need to eat less.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that don't exercise, but exactly, it's all about what you eat in terms of weight. And you're right, you do not, from a weight loss perspective, you don't need to do any exercise whatsoever. It's all to do with what you're eating.
Exactly. And I just want to emphasize, don't just eat less. I mean, eat the correct foods and you will eat less because you'll be
absolutely.
satisfied. Yeah,
absolutely.
So you can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to eat less Twinkies. No. So it's funny because you're doing all this work. It's not funny, but you're doing all this work to get it out of the hospital. And then I know that your father was recently in the hospital and they served him some of this pretty junk food.
Yeah, they gave him, he was he had a general anesthetic. He had an operation on his sinuses. So he'd come around from that. And obviously feeling extremely nauseous, as people do, and not great when you've just come out of the GA. What they gave him was an egg sandwich, but it was junk. It was just full of, I don't know, it had about 50 ingredients.
Like white bread. Yeah, it was like just this white bread
terrible.
with vegetable spread. I read it. I remember it.
It's horrible. Why are we serving this to patients? It's unbelievable. And one of the reasons, again, is a lack of understanding of the impact of nutrition on health. And we're in a space where, in some regards, a lot of this stuff has become an echo chamber, but it's good. It's a movement, and people who are listening, when I give my talks, I say we all have a role to play here. It's great that we're educating you and you're learning stuff and we're improving your health. But if you feel angry about this, if you want to do something, then just talk about it. Just speak out. Talk to your friends and family. Just get the message spread more and more and more. And this grassroots movement will continue to grow, and things will change. But you have to speak out. And it's one of the things that I realized as well is that there was a lack of acknowledgement of the impact of nutrition on health. A lot of doctors still don't really fully get it. Oh, they don't think it's important, and they think it doesn't matter what you eat, just take these pills. So I think one of the reasons for that is, again, because I think if people fully were aware, if the nurses and doctors were aware about how detrimental this food is, they wouldn't be serving it to patients. So it's a lack of knowledge is a big barrier to progress.
Well, yeah, it's sad because I know some nurses who are of normal weight and they say everyone around them is obese. It's a nightmare. It's just sad. And yeah, all we can do is speak out. I mean, we need to get beyond just the echo chamber, like you said. And I just posted this video today or yesterday. I actually spoke at a food industry conference and somehow I got called to come to Chicago and speak out. And all these fake food manufacturers were there and all the processed food people were there. It was 500 industry executives. And I got to spread the message of let's eat real foods. Let's eat animal foods. And it's not going to kill us and the environment. So that was really
excellent.
Cool.
Great work. No, it's important. I mean, I think that's, the real challenge again is the fact that there's so much money behind making people sick, for profit. And I don't think they're deliberately there to make people sick, but this is actually ultimately the side effect of what they do. It's about now winding back from those harms.
Mm-hmm. What about cholesterol? So that's a big thing that you talk about, and you wrote a big paper about that or whatever it was. Can you talk to me about that? Because I actually just had a conversation with another guy, Alex Leaf. He's kind of this nutrition researcher type of guy. And I don't know, I feel like I didn't, push back enough, or I always feel like I agree with people too much. I just want to get different opinions. But he seemed to have this sort of a bit standard view of cholesterol and LDL, and it's the most evil thing. So can you tell us about LDL?
Yeah, so just trying to be devil's advocate here, I think trying to understand where people who have the traditional view are coming from I would argue that mindset that the lower the LDL, the better, not just failed, but actually has caused significant harm to people, comes originally from the Framingham study, Brian, which was a study that started in 1948 in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, United States. And they basically, scientists decided they followed up about 5,000 people over several decades to look at what were predictors of disease development, specifically of cardiovascular disease. And actually from Framingham, we determined things like smoking was one of the things that was found to be harmful, high blood pressure, and from that high cholesterol too. But I think we need to define high cholesterol. And what we learn in medical school is, there are 4 major risk factors that we learn in medical school, certainly I learned in my day, for heart disease. And those were high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, and smoking. Okay, family history also comes down in point number 5. And that comes from the Framingham study. Now, when you look at the Framingham data, and this is something, I present on, you do find that people with very low levels of cholesterol, total cholesterol, so let's say less than 150 milligrams per deciliter, or in the UK, we use 3.8 as a rough conversion, 3.8 millimoles. From Framingham, those people, certainly up to the age of around 60, and this is crucial, didn't develop heart disease. Okay, there was no heart disease. At the other end of the spectrum, people who had a total cholesterol of above 300 and say 50 or whatever, which I think is around 10 millimoles here, it's very high. Those people had a very strong association in terms of developing heart disease. Interestingly, we know that those people now are the people that have a genetic predisposition to extremely high cholesterol levels called familial hyperlipidemia, which affects about 1 in 250 people. But crucially, for the overwhelming majority of people in Framingham, more than 90% of that population, the total cholesterol did not predict whether or not you're going to get heart disease. Okay, and what they did find is total cholesterol to HDL ratio was more predictive across different age groups and both sexes. Then you dive deeper, specifically looking at LDL. And again, I'm mentioning this is up to the age of 60. I'll come on to that after 60 in a minute. And that kind of really debunks the whole cholesterol hypothesis to a significant degree. But if your LDL was less than 7.8 millimoles or essentially less than 300, it was essentially useless as a biomarker in predicting risk of heart disease. And this is not my quote. This is actually a quote from one of the co-directors of Framingham, William Castelli, and he published this in the journal Atherosclerosis in 1996. I read that paper. So we've now got this situation where actually, in terms of predicting risk of heart disease, for most people, cholesterol is essentially useless in terms of total cholesterol. LDL is also useless. I'm very happy to debate this with anybody, by the way. I'm very happy. People, I always say, listen, I always learn new things, and it may be that I'm only seeing a certain amount of evidence, but I've looked at this in quite a lot of detail, and I've come from the other side. I've come from somebody who's accepted LDL cholesterol being the bogeyman to now realizing it's, basically, part of my language, bullshit. Absolute bullshit. So hold on, we'll come back to that. So we know also that most cholesterol, so in total cholesterol, LDL, most of it is genetic. You can influence it by diet. We know that. But let's just, certainly within Framingham, 80% of the people's cholesterol is genetic. So what we know is that people who had genetically low cholesterol will not develop heart disease. However, a lot of those people, certainly from these studies, also have genes that mean they're not going to develop high blood pressure. Now, hypertension, interestingly, is the number 1 risk factor for death globally. So imagine this. It may not be the cholesterol that's the issue. It may be the fact they actually don't have hypertension, or more importantly, that low cholesterol for those people genetically also means that they are genetically resistant to developing metabolic syndrome. Now, metabolic syndrome is actually responsible for 2/3 of people being admitted with heart attacks in the United States. That is the major issue, and that's synonymous with insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, this metabolic syndrome really is related to high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, increased waist circumference, hypertension, and pre-diabetes or type 2. If you have 3 of those 5, you've got metabolic syndrome, and you are then in the highest risk group of people to have a heart attack. Now, metabolic syndrome is not targeted with any lifestyle change specifically. The main way we target is we take individual risk factors like high blood pressure, so-called high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, and we treat each of those with individual drugs produced by the pharmaceutical industry, which in effect for most people is completely useless. So you throw all of that in, you can try and understand and explain why we've got this problem. Now, what also, I don't want to avoid talking about all of these different issues, but the other reason why people think the lower the LDL, the better, is a group of scientists from Oxford through publications that have then had big influence around the world. Within the scientific community, within cardiology, within lipidology, have said for every, as you lower the LDL, there is a linear reduction in risk of events of cardiovascular disease. There's a few problems with that. One is those risk of events is much smaller than what people are led to believe. Okay, so let me just give you one example. Statins are supposed to be most effective, powerful drug we've ever had in the history of medicine for tackling cardiovascular disease. And that is true. However, when you break it down and look to what that benefit is, don't just say it's a benefit. Say, well, what is the benefit? It's extremely small, certainly much smaller than people realize. So for people who haven't had a heart attack, even people who what we call high-risk primary prevention, they will not have their life expectancy extended from taking a statin. But about 1% of them will have a heart attack, a non-fatal heart attack or a stroke prevented over 5 years. Now, 1 in 100. And that's still best case scenario because all this data comes from the drug industry. When you look at the totality of data on LDL lowering, let's just look at drugs. Forget about diet. We'll come on to diet in a second. Well, actually, let's talk about diet. From diet, absolutely useless. No evidence at all. In fact, all of the data says that if you lower cholesterol from diet, LDL, from reducing saturated fat, whether you're primary prevention, whether you've had a heart attack, whoever you are, observational studies, randomized control trials, absolutely no benefit. Complete waste of time. Complete and total waste of time. That is irrefutable. I want someone to challenge me on this. Absolute nonsense. No one will challenge me because the evidence is very clear. If you ask anybody this, what evidence is there from changing diet and lowering LDL having an impact on reducing cardiovascular events? There is none. It doesn't exist. So I think that's one thing that people need to be aware of. It's a complete waste of time to lower cholesterol from diet. But when you look at drug trials, one of the arguments could be, okay, Aseem, fine. It's because diet doesn't have that much impact on LDL. Fair enough. You need to lower it more. So or you need to, LDL needs to be lowered by 50%. You need to get it into your boots, etc. When you look at all the drug trial data, there is absolutely no consistent evidence at all that the lower the LDL, the less the event rate. So this is also nonsense. So these guidelines are being put out by the American Heart Association, by the British Heart Foundation, saying that, for every 1 millimole you lower LDL, you reduce your risk of events by 20%. That is cherry-picked selected data, which is, in my view, all being pushed by scientists on the payroll of the drug industry. And this isn't about conspiracy theories. It's just the way business is done, but people are being massively misinformed.
I agree. I 100% agree. All this research, it's been paid for.
You can tell I'm quite passionate about this topic.
Yeah, well, that's why you're on the podcast here, letting people know, because so many people you don't hear about this type of stuff. No. I talk to people all the time. I talk to like the everyday person, I talk to people in the nutrition world. Of course, everyone knows it, but I'm going to weddings. These people talking to all these normal people, they have no clue about any of this. They're 15 years behind in the science.
But I think one of the challenges, Brian, as well, is that how we need to shine a light on all of this is that the reason, and completely understandably, because I was one of those people, is that people within that space, in the medical science space, in nutritional science space, they trust what they're being told by the so-called experts that develop the guidelines, and they don't question it. That's the reason. They don't realize about conflicts of interest. They don't realize about the uncertainties of the research or the reliability of it. They're not skilled or trained into analyzing that stuff. And even if you are, so let's just look at all those steps. Even if you get to that stage where you're enlightened, the next thing is, what are you going to do about it? Because it's not easy to come up and stand up against the establishment. Your colleagues, you face ridicule. I mean, I've been through all of this, but I'm thick-skinned enough to deal with it. But it is hard. It's not easy. It's challenging. But it's important. It's our duty. At the end of the day, for me, all I'm doing with all this advocacy work, all I am doing now is actually standing up for good medical practice, for ethical evidence-based medicine, and most importantly, doing my duty to patients. That's what I signed up to doing. That's what I swore an oath to. One of the articles I just wrote about, and again, I mentioned in some of my recent talks, for the King's Fund. I'm a trustee of a think tank called the King's Fund, which is an independent health think tank, considered the most influential and independent in influencing government health policy. And I talk about the 7 Nolan principles. So these are principles that all people in public life are supposed to adhere to. So this is doctors, this is nurses, people who serve the public, the needs of the public. This is the police officers, this is teachers. And those 7 noble principles, and I think no one can really argue against them in a way, that we all who serve the public need to uphold are being selflessness, having integrity, being objective, having accountability, being honest, being open, and showing leadership. And part of showing leadership is also not just upholding the principles, but being able to challenge poor behavior wherever it occurs. So all I'm doing, Brian, when people say, oh, is Aseem Malhotra, there are some people that obviously attack me, controversial, saying all this stuff, saying, no, actually, he's just doing his duty as a doctor. It's very simple. I think if all people within the profession looked in the mirror and looked at those principles and thought to themselves, am I really adhering to all of these? They'll realize they're not deliberately, but because the system has failed us. The system is failing the public that we serve. It's failing doctors, and it needs to be overhauled.
Yeah. Well, there's only 2 cardiologists I've ever heard of that in the world that have speak out about this. It's you and Dr. Brett Scher, who's been on the podcast. But what about statins? Have so many other problems. I don't want to go to statins forever. I think people should know by now that statins are a joke. But what other info do you have about statins?
Listen, I think the key thing is just people, if you're on a statin, is just know what your individual benefit is. And that's by asking your doctor, what is my absolute risk reduction? There is a website that is free that you can go to, which is set up by independent scientists who are very good at synthesizing data, and they put quality reviews out on various interventions we use in medicine. And one of them is on statins. It's called thennt.com. That's THE as in the word V, one word, NNT, numbers needed to treat.com. If you go to that website, you can then look at, these are basically reviews of evidence with conclusions based upon patient-important outcomes. So let me just give you one quick example. If you trust the industry-sponsored data and you don't get side effects and you've had a heart attack, then there's a 1 in 83 chance that taking a statin religiously every day for 5 years will delay your death, and 1 in 39 chance it will prevent a non-fatal heart attack. So that really is just giving one snapshot example for people to understand what individual benefit they're getting from statins. And if, given that information, they decided they didn't think that was very effective, or they were getting side effects, for example, and they decided they didn't want to take the statin, as long as they've told their doctor and discussed it with them and made an informed decision, that's completely fine and completely ethical.
Well, most people don't take them religiously. I mean, what's the average people get off them within 3 years, 5 years?
Well, before any sort of media awareness about the issue about side effects and probably what has been deliberately withheld information on the side effect prevalence, more than 50% of people in the real world, Brian, will stop taking a statin within a couple of years of prescription. And when you ask patients why, they say mainly because of side effects. So clearly, it's even from that perspective, even if there is a small benefit, the fact that there's such a poor adherence rate, probably because of side effects, is also another argument to say that this approach on a population level certainly has failed and we need to think differently.
Well, it seems you're messing with your body's natural biological functions. And so it's pretty obvious there will be some side effects. And really the problem, go back to this, is insulin resistance. I mean, if you're talking about the real problem, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, that's basically indication of insulin resistance. And that tracks way greater than just like the LDL or the total cholesterol.
Yeah, if you break down all the different web of causation, in terms of heart disease and risk factors, insulin resistance is the number one risk factor. Although people will argue it's not really a risk factor, but let's just say, for argument's sake, actually, we need to treat it as a risk factor because that is the most prevalent underlying, pathological process, the biggest predictor for you having a heart attack. And yes, you're right. I think that it's most probable that these cholesterol profile is a marker of insulin resistance rather than being causal.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is, and this is again an argument people give about, okay, we have got data to show that lowering LDL from certain drug trials does reduce events and mortality. That has never been shown for triglycerides and HDL. So if you look at drug trials that have lowered triglycerides or raised HDL, they haven't had any effect. So you could then counter the argument that we're giving, saying, well, actually triglycerides and HDL are not that important and they're not causal, and therefore you shouldn't do anything about them. And I think actually there is a point to be made there. But the actual ratio itself, from my perspective, and I'm willing, I'm open to things changing and being challenged on this, it's just a marker of excess body fat percentage and insulin resistance. And when you correct that, and certainly I see that with my patients, the triglyceride to HDL ratio gets significantly improved. And of course, that is dietary changes that cut out ultra-processed food, Certainly one very effective approach, as you know, is cutting out sugar and refined carbohydrates. You can probably do it from a plant-based diet, but again, it still means cutting out the refined carbohydrates and sugar. And that is crucial to its management.
Well, yeah. So you're talking about you're changing that ratio. You're changed with diet and lifestyle. So you did these healthy things that made you healthier. If I could see if people are trying to use drugs or these drug companies are trying to almost artificially fix trigs or HDL, that it's not going to do anything because it's not addressing the root cause.
Yeah, and it's not just not doing anything. So when we think about patients, we're treating a whole patient. We're not just treating individual risk factors. So one of the arguments I give about how statins have caused a net harm is if you're treating masses of the population, and it's estimated probably about 100 million people are prescribed statins around the world, 30 million in America. If you're treating them with this so-called statin drug, where the evidence from those trials in those groups of patients show no benefit in terms of mortality or cardiovascular mortality reduction, and yet for that individual patient, they think that they're done. They've lowered their cholesterol with statin, they're fine, they can eat what they like, then actually they're going to cause a net harm to themselves if they end up becoming obese or overweight. And we call this statin gluttony, and it's a phenomenon that exists and it has evidence to support it. That people who take statins, many of those people think it gives them the illusion of protection and that they can eat what they like. So you're actually think about this as a doctor. If a doctor's listening to this, think about that concept for a second. You're potentially causing a harm to a patient if you're prescribing them a statin without actually telling them the chances of them benefiting are minuscule. And it means that they think they can eat what they like. You're causing a harm to your patient.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. Okay, so you treated some patients that had familial hypercholesterolemia. So this guy was trying to say that just because, or Alex Leaf that I talked to earlier, saying that LDL, just having it around is a problem, even though there's many other risk factors. But I know that these certain people you treated had 0 CAC scores.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the calcium score is obviously a newer test that is well validated, the most predictive test for telling you your risk of heart attack or stroke, more than any other combination of risk factors, and certainly in the next 10 years. And it tells you whether you've got underlying heart disease. A number of patients I've seen who have had, very high LDL levels and high total cholesterol diagnosed in their 50s, essentially familial hyperlipidemia, didn't want to go on statins, and they're in this position like they're very fit and active. They're very, all their metabolic markers are perfectly normal. Yet they're being scaremongered by so-called lipid specialists. By the way, let's just briefly talk about a lot of these people who are so-called specialists. You've got to realize, one, that's their job. So their whole life and everything for their profession is dedicated to lowering cholesterol or highlighting the harms of it. And also that's how they're paid. Mm-hmm. So you said, well, hold on, what about all these lipid specialists? Well, hold on, people need to realize that these guys have a huge bias through their profession about the way they approach medicine. But anyway, I just want to emphasize and make that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, had been scaremongered. The reason I mentioned it had been scaremongered. I'd seen letters saying that they were insane. One cardiologist wrote to a patient. I mean, it was extraordinary in that the patient is not considering going on a statin. I think this is pure insanity. Okay, this is what they'd written. I would argue that doctor is behaving in a way that fits more that description than the patient. Anyway, they didn't want to go on statins. That was their ideal preference and value. But they said, Doc, listen, if you really think I should go on one, then let's have a discussion about it. I said, okay, well, what we can do is we can do a coronary calcium score, even a CT coronary angiogram. And logic would dictate that if you've had this genetically high cholesterol all your life, okay, you're now in your 50s, there will be some heart disease there if this is a risk factor for you. It may be a lot, it may be a little, but there will be some. And they all came back with 0 calcium scores and completely clean coronary arteries on the CT coronary angiogram. And therefore, I could reassure them that for them, their high cholesterol is not a problem. And that was it. End of story. Well, they were happy. They didn't need a statin. They carry on with their lives.
Yeah. I don't think it would make sense if LDL was the devil. Because for me and many other people in our world, they make these dietary changes, they lose weight, they feel amazing, they have better blood lipid, total other trigs, the HDL, everything on the planet gets better. And then the one thing out of 100, the LDL goes up a bit. I don't understand why that would be bad. Like, there's got to be something else going on here. It doesn't make sense really that our human physiology works that way.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the people that hyper respond, who have there are a number of people that have an LDL that skyrockets after they go low.
That's skyrocketing. That's a different story. And yes, that's like Dave Feldman.
But the majority, if you look at it on overall average or whatever, in these are, you're right, a few individuals do have this, and I agree with you. I don't think there's anything they should be worried about. But actually, on average, we know low carb diets don't actually have any impact really on LDL on average for people. And in many ways, their LDL comes down or their profile improves. So I wouldn't be overly worried about it. But you're right. I think that, this fear mongering has been so imprinted within the medical and public mindset for so long. It takes time for it to be overturned, even when the science is pretty overwhelming. It takes time for the whole thing to be overturned. Let's just give you an example. We know cholesterol in egg yolks doesn't raise blood cholesterol, but how many people out there still think it does? And that's, it's 2015, I think the nutritional guidelines updated and said that cholesterol in food is not a threat to blood cholesterol. So, but there are people, you walk around New York, I was in the States and they were like egg white omelets. Like, why? Like, why would I want an egg white omelet? Can you explain it to me? Oh, because cholesterol is bad. No, it's not. What are you talking about? So the dissemination of this information is also crucial. And that will only happen through public education campaigns and through use of the mainstream media. It's all well and good, for example, the American Diabetes Association putting in somewhere in their, whatever document on updated document on management type 2 diabetes that low carb diets are safe and effective. But if it doesn't disseminate to, the whole profession and saying, listen, the big, massive statement, big news story, by the way, we've updated it, everyone should know about it, then you're still going to get a lot of this old practice and people being ignorant of the evidence and therefore not fully informing their patients.
Yeah, man, I wish I remembered all this earlier when I was talking to this guy. But even the Simone too, I was trying to remember this. There's this,
By the way, this chap you spoke to what's his background? He's a cardiologist, lipid specialist?
No, he's just he's just like a, researcher, scientist type of guy.
Yeah, to be fair to him, he is making his decisions and his discussion with you based upon the information that he's aware of. One of the quotes, the father of the evidence-based medicine movement is a professor called David Sackett. He's now sadly dead. He was a Canadian epidemiologist. He's considered one of the founding fathers behind this concept of what evidence-based medicine is, which is about using your individual clinical expertise, the best available evidence, and taking patient preferences and values in consideration to produce the best outcomes through informed decision-making. And he also said 50% of what you learn in medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is nobody can tell you which half, so you have to learn on your own. So, to be fair to this chap you spoke to, almost certainly he's making his decisions and the discussion based upon the information he's aware of and is probably not aware of all of the data and those arguments. And I think and the harms. There's not just, if LDL lowering was like, okay, you could get some benefit and there's absolutely no harm whatsoever, I wouldn't have an issue. But for me personally, this obsession with LDL lowering, Brian, is actually at the very root of our whole chronic disease crisis. Mm-hmm. It's at the very root of it all, because LDL lowering is about low saturated fat diets. It's produced a low fat junk food industry, high sugar diet, refined carbohydrates, massive explosion in obesity and type 2 diabetes, no reduction in cardiovascular disease death rates that can be attributed through those dietary changes. Actually, we've made it all worse. And this is because of this reductionist approach that it's all about LDL. The lower the better, and nothing else is anywhere close to being as important in terms of managing or tackling heart disease.
It's crazy. And I should remind you to go back to the people over 60. So when you're over 60 in the Framingham, what happened?
Well, interestingly, for total cholesterol, it was, this is a phenomenon that was baffled a lot of scientists at the time, is that as cholesterol dropped, your mortality increased. Mm-hmm. So what we did was, myself and a number of international scientists did a systematic review. We went back and took data on people to see whether in those people over 60, was there any correlation with heart disease, and what was the correlation with all-cause mortality? We found no correlation with heart disease and a reduction in all-cause mortality of the higher LDL. So in other words, the higher LDL, if you're over 60, the less likely you are to die statistically. So yes, that's another thing to throw in there, because there has been a move to try and mass medicate people on statins in the old age groups. There's a big problem with that. One is the evidence shows there's almost no benefit whatsoever. If you haven't had a heart attack, then The actual NNT, the benefit for people who are certainly, over 75 is something like 1 in 446. And again, those statin benefits may well be, probably most likely, those small benefits are not through lowering LDL, probably through some anti-inflammatory or anti-thrombotic mechanism. So that's, again, a waste of time. And that's before you take consideration the fact that one of the groups who are most likely and susceptible to side effects from statins are the elderly. Mm-hmm. So for me, there is no reason at all, other than a subgroup of people who have very high risk of had a heart attack, for example. And even then, they're still going to be, susceptible to side effects and have a small benefit from the statin. There is absolutely no reason to prescribe cholesterol lowering in people over the age of 60. Otherwise, you should just forget about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought I've seen research that, especially in women, it's protective as they age.
Yeah, could well be. A lot of these studies were done on men. So, women were not studied as well, certainly even within Framingham. It was mainly men who were studied. And women, as you know, are a different beast.
Yeah.
Biologically, psychologically, they're very different to men.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to figure them out.
You're still working on that, are you?
I'm working on finding a woman in LA that will eat meat. I joke around a lot on this podcast that I've yet to meet a girl that eats meat in LA. I went on 2 more dates recently since I last talked about it. Both of them 90% plant-based, and they eat like maybe an egg like once a week. And like,
on that note, I don't know, you may know this data or not. I suspect the vegan movement is probably, if you look at, I don't know if people have broken down veganism in terms of sex, but my guess is, certainly what I've observed, the majority are women. Yep. And I wonder whether that's not in a kind of, I don't say this in a patronizing way, but I say actually maybe because, and again, I'm just thinking aloud here, women generally are more empathetic human beings than men. And certainly the narrative on veganism, the strongest argument is about the cruelty to animals. So maybe that's the link between that. I don't know.
There's something. It doesn't seem ladylike to crush a steak either. There's a bunch of things going on. And, I've talked to different women about it because I don't know. I'll defer to them, but there's something going on. I just want to find some people that don't believe all that don't.
You want to find a woman that likes eating meat, basically.
I guess so. Just at least be open to eating an egg and having a piece of fish, have a steak once in a while.
Okay, all right. If you're listening out there, people, Brian, if there's a woman out there that likes to eat egg and fish and steak, well, Brian's out there, so get in touch with him.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. So let's wrap this up. What's the future then? How do we fix this? What's your idea? Like you're doing some things, you're making noise, getting sugar tax, getting things out of hospitals. What else can we do?
Well, we just need to keep making noise, Brian. I think the kind of work you're doing, disseminating this information, getting people aware of the areas they haven't been exposed to that probably would make significant differences to the way they make decisions about their health on a day-to-day basis. I think we just need to fight for that and be advocates for that, and just keep going as a movement. There's so many people involved in this who are doing great work around the world. And we know that it's challenging, but we also need help from people on the ground. We need, people who are listening to this to also take action. We all have a role to play. We can all have an impact in our own lives. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think for me, one of my inspirations in terms of a revolutionary was Mahatma Gandhi. And one of the things that, he talked about, one of the ways he was able to highlight the injustices being inflicted on, the Indian population, or to get the British Empire out of India and give India independence, was really highlighting this as being an injustice. What was going on. You think about Martin Luther King, and what they did was, what they were very effective at doing is getting the media on board, because they also had a very basic belief, which I also concur with, is that most people, Brian, want to do the right thing. We, as individuals, we hate injustice to see injustice. Most of us want to do the right thing. We want to all live in harmony. We want peace and happiness and prosperity for as many people as possible. And what's challenging that now is what is a gross injustice that is being committed by the very, industries that are profiting from misleading people. And I think in modern democracy, most people, 99.99% of people, would find that unacceptable and they wouldn't be happy with it. So the way to change things is make this injustice visible. So you think about your own life. is that if you're listening to this and you want to inform yourself and improve your health of you and your friends and your family, when you do that, you'll also realize that, wow, this is, I've been misinformed and misled for so long. I'm enlightened. How can I help my community? How can I help people around me get healthier? Do your bit to make that injustice visible.
I like that. Are you writing another book?
Yeah, I'm just in the process of writing another book at the moment, which again just kind of puts the evidence about statins into the mainstream a little bit more in terms of a way that people can understand risks, benefits, etc. But also, my other interest now is on I'm developing my research interest is going into a heart disease reversal. And what does the evidence tell us about that? What can we do about it? And then really we need more data and more trials. But yes, so I'm putting that all together, and I'm hoping it will come out in the United States simultaneously with the UK, which will be next year.
I love that. And yeah, I am starting to hear whispers of this reversal thing. People thought that, you get the CAC score and then you just try to slow it down, but it's not reversible. But we have.
Well, at the very least, even slowing down the progression, I think is a great achievement, because the natural progression of coronary artery disease people think that once you get it, it's going to progress. You've got all these drugs, statins, aspirin, etc. But even then, it's not great in terms of slowing progression. I think there's more effective ways of doing that. And you're right. Absolutely. I think if some people are able to reverse it as well, even better.
Well, that's what we're all about around here, is reversing chronic disease with diet and lifestyle. So
let's keep going, man. Let's keep pushing the message out.
Keep it going. All right. Well, we'll find you on Twitter. Mostly.
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm on just Dr. Aseem Malhotra. I do a lot of stuff. I post a lot of stuff on Facebook as well. Just if you look up Aseem Malhotra, you'll find me on Facebook. And my Instagram handle is Lifestyle Medicine Doctor.
All right. I love it. There's a chance I'll be out in London at some point in the summer.
Excellent. Well, there's a good chance I'm back in Southern California as well in the summer as well. So it'll be great to connect.
All right. Thanks for listening. Please rate the show on iTunes or the podcast app. Please go to sapien.org and find out everything we're doing. Please support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/pqmin. And stay happy and healthy, my friends.